Conference room smelled like old coffee and something colder than that. Tension, maybe, or judgment. My brother's attorney looked at me from across the table, and for a second he almost smiled. Almost. Then the mediator walked in, and everything changed. I'll back up. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my life, I was the family embarrassment, not the black sheep. That's too dramatic. More like the beige sheep. The one nobody expected much from. The one whose choices nobody understood. Whose phone calls home always ended a little too quickly. Whose seat at Thanksgiving dinner was always slightly apart from everyone else's. Not kicked out. Just adjusted. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house with a cracked driveway and a basketball hoop my dad put up the summer before he lost interest in teaching us anything. My older brother, Kevin, was the kind of kid who made everything look easy. Honor roll without studying, the right friends without trying, the right girlfriend at the right time. My parents used to say he had it. I heard that word so many times growing up that I started to wonder what it even was, and whether someone had taken mine. I wasn't bad at school. I just wasn't interested in the things that made people pay attention. I didn't want to be a lawyer or go into finance or marry someone with a good last name. I wanted to help people in a way that was quiet and direct and didn't require anyone to applaud. So I became a nurse. My mother was polite about it the first time I told her. She nodded and said, "That's steady work." My dad didn't say anything. Kevin, who was already in his second year of law school at Ohio State, looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "You could have gone pre-med, you know." I could have. I didn't want to. That was the beginning of the gap. Over the years, the gap became a distance. Kevin married well. His words, not mine. His wife came from a family with a lake house in Michigan and opinions about everything. She was smart, genuinely, but she had a way of asking questions that weren't really questions. "So you're still at the hospital?" "Yes." "Same unit?" "Yes." "They must keep you busy?" "Yes." I was a trauma nurse in the ICU at Miami Valley Hospital. For 8 years. I worked nights. I worked holidays. I worked the kind of shifts where you go home and sit in your car in the parking garage for 10 minutes before you could make yourself drive. I held people's hands when their families couldn't be there. I made calls that no one wants to make. I learned things about the human body and the human spirit that you cannot learn anywhere except that room, that specific room with the beeping and the quiet and the weight of it all. But none of that came up at family dinners. What came up was Kevin's promotion, Kevin's new car, Kevin's daughter's dance recital. What came up was my mother worrying that I was alone too much, and whether I'd thought about a different path. What came up once from my aunt, who I otherwise love, was the observation that nursing isn't exactly a career, is it? I stopped going home for Christmas after the year my dad handed Kevin an envelope with a check in it for investment seed money and handed me a Kohl's gift card. I didn't make a scene. I drove home through the snow, sat in my apartment, and ate leftover soup. I told myself it was fine. It wasn't fine. But I was busy, and being busy is a good place to put things you don't want to look at. The situation with Grandma Ruth came out of nowhere, and also didn't surprise me at all. Grandma Ruth was my father's mother. She was 83, stubborn, funny in a dry way that caught you off guard, and one of the only people in my family who called me on my birthday every single year without fail. She lived in a small house in Centerville, about 20 minutes from my apartment, which is why I was the one who checked on her. Not because anyone asked me to, just because I lived close and she was alone and someone should. I took her to her cardiology appointments. I filled her pill organizer when she kept mixing up her metoprolol and her lisinopril. I drove her to the grocery store on Sundays and sat with her in her kitchen while she made coffee that was too strong and told me stories about people I'd never met. I knew which drawer she kept her important documents in. I knew which neighbor had a key. I knew her doctor's name and her allergist's name and the name of the priest she liked at St. Helens. Kevin visited twice a year, Easter and her birthday. He brought good wine and charmed everyone in the room, and when he left, Grandma Ruth always said, "That boy. He does have a way about him." She meant it kindly. She also always watched him drive away with something in her face I couldn't quite name. In February of last year, Grandma Ruth had a minor stroke. She recovered, mostly. Her left hand was a little slower. Her words sometimes came out in the wrong order and she'd stop, blink, and try again. But she was herself. She knew who she was. She knew who I was. And she had opinions about everything from the weather to the current state of network television. A month after she came home from rehab, she called me. "I need to talk to you about the house," she said. "I went over on a Saturday." She had the coffee ready. We sat at her kitchen table, the one with the gouge in the corner from when my uncle dropped a cast-iron pan in 1987, and she told me she had decided to update her will. She wanted to leave the house to me. Not because she didn't love Kevin or my father. She was clear about that, but she said, "You are here. You are here. I am not a fool, Claire. I know what it means when someone shows up and what it means when they don't." I told her she didn't have to do that. She said she knew she didn't have to. She wanted to. She called her attorney the following week. Grandma Ruth passed in September. It was a second stroke, larger than the first, and she went quietly, which was exactly how she would have wanted to go. I was with her. I called my dad from the hospital parking lot. He cried, which I didn't expect because he doesn't usually let me see that. I drove to my apartment and sat in the dark for a while and thought about her kitchen and her coffee and the way she said my name, fully, both syllables, like it meant something. The funeral was in Centerville. Kevin flew in from Chicago with his wife and their daughter. He spoke at the service. He was good at that, speaking, finding the right words in the right order. My mother held my hand during the hymn, which was more than I expected. Then the will was read. I had forgotten, in the grief of it, what Grandma Ruth had told me that Saturday. Kevin hadn't forgotten anything because Kevin hadn't known anything. When the attorney got to the part about the house, the room went very still. My father looked at Kevin. Kevin looked at the attorney. His wife's face did something careful and controlled. Then Kevin looked at me. "Is this a joke?" he said. It wasn't really a question. The next 3 months were the worst of my life in a specific, grinding way that's different from acute pain. It wasn't one sharp thing. It was constant. It was texts I didn't respond to and voicemails I couldn't finish listening to, and a certified letter from Kevin's attorney that arrived on a Tuesday and made my hands shake. Kevin was contesting the will. His argument essentially was that Grandma Ruth had been mentally compromised following the stroke and had been unduly influenced. The unduly influenced party, according to the letter, was me. I read it 3 times. Then I set it on my kitchen counter and stood there for a long time. My mother called me that evening. I expected her to tell me Kevin was wrong, or that she talked to him, or at minimum that she was sorry. Instead she said, "Claire, you have to understand how this looks. It looks like you took advantage of her." "I took her to her doctor's appointments," I said. I know that Kevin is saying. I know what Kevin is saying. There was a pause. Then she said quietly, "Maybe you should just let the family work this out." I hung up. I had never hung up on my mother before in my life. My co-worker, a charge nurse named Terry, who has seen every variety of human behavior after 22 years in trauma, sat with me in the break room at 2 a.m. and listened to all of it. When I finished, she said, "You have to fight this." I said I didn't know if I had the energy. She said, "You fight harder than anyone I've ever worked with. I've seen you. Don't let them take that from you." I found an estate attorney, Paul Whitfield. He had an office in a strip mall in Kettering, which I mentioned because it was nothing like what I expected, but he knew exactly what he was doing. He listened to everything I told him. Then he said, "Do you have documentation of your involvement in your grandmother's care?" I had all of it. Every appointment summary, every pharmacy receipt, her cardiologist's notes, which I'd been copied on with her permission, text messages, a calendar I kept on my phone because I'm a nurse and tracking things is what I do. Paul looked at the stack I brought him and said, "Good." The mediation was set for a Thursday in March at an office building downtown. I wore my grey blazer. I arrived 7 minutes early and sat in the lobby and told myself to breathe. Kevin arrived with his attorney. He was wearing a suit I'd never seen. He didn't look at me when he walked in. His wife had written a statement. I found that out later. The statement described me as isolated and fixated, and suggested that I had cultivated dependency in an elderly woman for personal gain. I want to be very clear about how that landed when I read it, because I think it's important. It didn't make me angry. It made me tired. A different kind of tired than a 12-hour shift. The kind that settles in your chest. The mediator was a woman in her 60s, named Judge Patricia Elaine Howell. She had retired from the Montgomery County Common Pleas Court 2 years earlier, and now did private mediation. She sat at the head of the table, read through the documents in front of her, and said nothing for a long time. Kevin's attorney opened. He talked about the stroke, about cognitive vulnerability, about patterns of isolation. He used the phrase undue influence 4 times. He was polished. He was prepared. Then Judge Howell looked up. "Before we go further," she said, "I'd like to understand the nature of the claimant's relationship with the decedent prior to the changes in the estate plan." She looked at Kevin's attorney. "You described the decedent's granddaughter." She nodded toward me, as having inserted herself into the care situation. "Can you tell me specifically when this insertion began?" The attorney said the relationship had intensified after the stroke. "Intensified," Judge Howell repeated. She looked down at the documents again. "I'm looking at pharmacy records from 2021, appointment records from 2020. A note here from Dr. Renata Okafor at the Ohio Heart and Vascular Institute indicating that," she paused, reading, "that the patient's granddaughter Claire had been accompanying her to appointments and was instrumental in identifying a medication interaction in the fall of 2022 that, and I'm quoting the physician's note directly, may have prevented a serious adverse event." The room was quiet. "That's 2022, she said. "The stroke was 2024. So when, exactly, did the insertion begin?" Kevin's attorney started to say something. Judge Howell held up one hand, not unkindly, and he stopped. She looked at Kevin directly. "Your grandmother was a patient at Miami Valley Hospital during her stroke and recovery. Your sister works in the ICU at Miami Valley Hospital." She paused. "I know some of the people there. I served on their ethics board for 6 years." She let that sit for a moment. "I also know that the kind of care documented here, the appointments, the medications, the follow-through, that isn't what exploitation looks like. I've seen exploitation looks like. I've seen exploitation. This is not that." Kevin said, "She still had influence over. Your grandmother was assessed by 2 independent neurologists post-stroke," Judge Howell said calmly. "Both assessments indicated preserved decision-making capacity. Both are in the file your own attorney submitted. I'm curious whether you read them." The attorney shifted in his seat. I had not moved. I had not said a single word. I was looking at the table, and I was thinking about Grandma Ruth's kitchen, and I was not going to cry in this room. Judge Howell set down the papers. She looked at Kevin again, and her voice was not unkind. It was something harder than unkind. It was honest. "I understand grief does strange things to families," she said. "I understand that when someone you love leaves something to someone unexpected, it can feel like a statement. And maybe it was. But statements made by a woman in full possession of her faculties are not grounds for a legal challenge. They are her final word." She let the silence hold for a moment. "I'd encourage your client to consider what he wants the next step to look like. Not legally. Personally." Kevin's attorney asked for a brief recess. They left the room. I sat there with Paul, who touched my arm once and said nothing. I was grateful for that. They came back 15 minutes later. Kevin's attorney said they were prepared to withdraw the challenge. Kevin looked across the table at me. He looked like someone who had been up too late or who had driven a long way and wasn't sure why. He looked honestly like my brother. Not the version with the right suit and the right words. The one I remembered from before all of it. He said, "I didn't think it would go this far." I didn't say anything. He said, "I thought, I didn't know. I didn't know she was doing all of that. Nobody told me. Nobody asked," I said. He looked away. "I know." Paul wrapped up the paperwork. I shook Judge Howell's hand on the way out and thanked her. She said, "Take care of yourself, not just other people." She said it like she meant it. I didn't go home right away. I drove to Centerville. I parked in front of Grandma Ruth's house, my house technically now, though it didn't feel like that yet, and I sat and looked at it. The window box she planted every spring was empty. The stone door needed a new handle. The maple in the front yard was just barely starting to bud, small and tentative, the way early spring always looked in Ohio. I thought about the last Saturday I sat in her kitchen. She told me a story about my grandfather that I'd never heard before. Something about a road trip they took in 1974, before they had kids, when they drove to the Grand Canyon and got spectacularly lost and laughed about it the whole way home. She told it like it had just happened, like she could still feel the sun on her arm through the car window. She had looked at me when she finished and said, "You have good eyes, Claire. You notice things." I hadn't known what to say to that. I'd just nodded and held my coffee cup. I know what she meant now. My phone buzzed, a text from Kevin. "Can we talk?" "Not about the house. Just talk." I looked at it for a long time. He wasn't a bad person. I had to believe that, or at least leave room for it. He had moved away and gotten busy and let the distance become habit. I understood that, maybe more than I wanted to. I had done my own version of it, just in a different direction. I typed back, "Yeah, call me this weekend." I put the phone down and looked at the maple tree for another few minutes. Then I got out of the car and walked up to the door. I had the key on a small ring with a yellow tag, the one Grandma Ruth labeled in her handwriting, "Spare for Claire." I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled like her, like the coffee that was always too strong, and something floral I could never identify, and old wood and home. I stood in the hallway and let that be enough for a while. The stone door clicked shut behind me. In the kitchen, through the doorway, I could see the edge of the table with the gouge in the corner. The afternoon light came in through the window, over the sink the same way it always had. I thought about what Terry had said to me in that break room at 2 a.m. "You fight harder than anyone I've ever worked with." I hadn't thought of it as fighting. I had just thought of it as showing up. Over and over. Through nights and early mornings and hard phone calls and harder rooms. Showing up because someone needed to, because I was there. Because that's what you do when you love someone, even when it's quiet and it's inconvenient and nobody's handing you an envelope at Christmas. Grandma Ruth knew. She always knew. I walked into the kitchen and pulled out the chair, the one I always sat in, and sat down. Outside, the maple kept doing what maples do in March in Ohio, slowly, without any announcement. I sat there in the quiet until I was ready to go home. I've thought a lot about what made that room go quiet. It wasn't anything I said. I didn't say much of anything that day. It was the paperwork. The pharmacy receipts, the appointment summaries, the physician's note from Dr. Pert, Okafor that used the phrase "may have prevented a serious adverse event." All of it sitting in a folder in order the way I keep everything, because that's what you do when someone's life depends on you not losing track of things. I used to think that being careful and being quiet and just doing the work was somehow less than what other people were doing. Kevin was loud in the way that gets you noticed. He had the right words, the right timing, the right room. I drove my grandmother to her cardio appointments on Tuesday mornings and sat in waiting rooms reading old magazines and making sure she took her metoprolol and not her lisinopril. Nobody noticed that. Nobody was supposed to. What I understand now is that the two things, the noticing and the not being noticed, were never in conflict. They were the same thing. You show up quietly because the person needs you to show up, not because someone's keeping score. But life has its own way of keeping score. It just doesn't always show you the tally when you expect it. Grandma Ruth saw it. She sat across from me in her kitchen and said, "You have good eyes, Claire. You notice things." At the time, I thought she was just being kind. She wasn't being kind, she was being exact. She had lived long enough to know the difference between someone who comes around when it's convenient and someone who comes around because they can't not. She knew which one I was. She wrote it down in a legal document and signed her name. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't require an audience. It just requires you to keep doing it anyway. The Tuesday after Tuesday after Tuesday, when no one is watching and nothing feels meaningful, and you're driving home on the highway at 6 in the morning after a 12-hour shift, thinking about whether any of it matters. It matters. It always mattered. You just don't always get to see the receipt. And Kevin, I want to be honest about Kevin, because it would be easy to make him the villain and leave it there. He wasn't. He was someone who made distance a habit and then woke up one day and realized the distance had cost him something he didn't know he was losing. That's not evil. That's just a slow and ordinary kind of not paying attention. The kind most of us are capable of if we're not careful. When he texted me after, "Can we talk? Not about the house, just talk," I sat with that for a long time. I could have said no. I had reasons. But I thought about what Grandma Ruth said once, that the people who are hardest to forgive are usually the ones who never meant to hurt you and just didn't know any better. Forgiving them isn't for them. It's so you don't carry their weight forever. I'm not all the way there yet. But I texted back. That felt like enough for now. What I'm left with, sitting in that kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window over the sink, is this: the life you build in the quiet. The skills, the consistency, the care you give when there's nothing in it for you. That life is solid. It doesn't disappear when someone challenges it. It shows up in folders, in physician's notes, in the way a retired judge looks at an attorney and says, very calmly, "This is not what exploitation looks like." Terry told me I fight harder than anyone she knows. I still don't think of it as fighting. I think of it as not leaving. That's all it ever was. I just didn't leave.